Hi everyone, welcome to Chapter 3, which is all about migration. Migration has been in the news a lot lately, which is going to be the basis for one of your exercises in this week's module. And so we're talking about people migrating all around the world. Why do they migrate and how do they migrate? And for example, here is a Chinatown in the country of Singapore. In many cities in the US too, we have Chinatowns. So these little ethnic enclaves. And so how do people migrate, and where do they migrate, and why are they migrating? So first we're going to look at different types of migration streams. So there's some migration streams that are one direction between specific places. And this is also can be international migration, right? So we have an Ethiopian restaurant in San Diego, right? There is a significant Ethiopian and Eritrean population in San Diego. So we have people, generally speaking, this is a one-direction migration stream, people migrating from Ethiopia to San Diego, right? So international migration is from one country to another. Then we have internal migration, which is within a single country. So there's a couple types of internal migration. There's interregional, where you are migrating within a single country, but to different regions. So here is a bar in Denver where Chicago Bears fans are watching a football game. And so you can have this migration for a variety of reasons. It can usually often is employment-based. But again, migrating within a country but between regions. And then you could have intra-regional migration, which is, for example, suburbanization. This is Tierra Santa in San Diego, which is a suburb of San Diego. And so you have people who used to live in the city of San Diego and then migrated out into the suburbs. We had a lot of suburban migration in the past in the U.S. People are kind of tending to migrate back into cities now and out of cities, but there was a lot of white flight from cities, so a lot of places in cities got neglected as everybody migrated out, but some people are starting to migrate back into those spaces. And we have this happening not just in the United States, but here's an example of international, interregional, and intra-regional migration with concerns to Mexico and Central America. So you have people, which has been in the news a lot now, migrating from Central America through Mexico to the United States. You have people migrating within Mexico as well, sometimes just going from rural areas to urban areas looking for work, or sometimes migrating from the southeast of Mexico up closer towards the U.S.-Mexico border, as there may be more employment opportunities, but staying within Mexico. This picture up top is a picture of people riding on top of a train through Mexico. A lot of images like this have been in the news. A lot of people have traveled through Mexico from Central America on these trains. And so migration is happening all of the time. 3.2% of people live outside their country of birth. Some of you might live outside of your country of birth. That's a total of 230 million people worldwide. In the U.S., we have about 14.3% that are foreign-born, or about 45 million people total. And that percentage in the U.S. is not particularly high. A lot of people migrate here for a variety of reasons, which we'll talk about later, particularly from Asia and Central and South America. But plenty of other countries like the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Kuwait have much higher rates of foreign-born people living there, who are usually coming for economic opportunities, but for other opportunities as well. You are going to look at, for another one of your exercises, this website that looks at migration streams. And so you will have some instructions on how to complete that exercise. But basically, you can click on different countries, and countries that are blue, that have a blue dot, like the United States, as you can see here, have a net in migration. So we have more people coming to the United States than leaving. Countries with a red dot have more people leaving. That big red dot that you can see right over here, that is Syria. Lots of people leaving Syria because of the horrific civil war that is happening there. But you can click on each of these dots inside this migration map and kind of get a single country view of where people are coming to and leaving. And so you're going to be doing that. You're going to be looking at you're going to look at 2 different countries, and you're going to do some background research, and you're going to tell me, why do you think people are traveling to and from these countries? Why are they migrating? And so how does somebody decide to migrate in the first place? It's not easy, right? Sometimes it happens pretty quickly, especially if you're fleeing violence or war, but generally speaking, it is a difficult decision to make to leave your home, and often leave your home with not very much. When you have problems that are occurring in your current location, these are push factors. These are things that are pushing you out of your country or your region. And I'll talk about what push factors, give you some examples of push factors, right? So perhaps you are fleeing war or famine. Positive attributes of the destination that you are going to are pull factors, right? So the United States, for a long time, when my grandparents on my mother's side arrived through Ellis Island, kind of had this unlimited, mostly unlimited immigration from Europe, and people were coming to the United States, my grandparents included, looking for a better life and more opportunity. Usually it's a combination of these two, right? You're being pushed out of somewhere because of something, and you're being pulled, you're going to the place that you're being pulled to because of some type of opportunity there, or something that is attractive to you. Sometimes it's strictly a push, and sometimes it's strictly a pull, but usually it's a combination of the two. So what are some push factors that can make you leave your country? Lack of economic opportunity. Zimbabwe, just the picture up there at the top, they had a very poorly managed country. The leader there left power a little while ago, but massive inflation. So that says starving billionaire. That's because the inflation was so high that people were getting huge stacks of money just to go do grocery shopping, right? So they have there's not a lot of employment or economic opportunity there. Persecution. Picture here from Hong Kong is kind of a crackdown by the government on religious groups. Generally speaking, the Chinese government does not like hierarchical religious groups. So here they are saying that this particular religion is an evil cult, so lots of people flee due to religious persecution. Instability, famine, and it's often a combination of these things. And so when we talk about instability, this is a picture of Aleppo from Syria, right? Unstable government situation, war, violence, and hunger. People will move and migrate in order to survive. Right, so we have lots of refugees. Refugees are migrants who are seeking safety, right? So they are leaving because there is a high chance that they will be killed or their children will be killed in their country. And so they are migrating due to that. This map here is always changing with some frequency. You have places that are the origin of refugees, places like Colombia and the Central African Republic, places that are origins and destinations of refugees, places like Iraq, where you have Syrian refugees flooding out of Syria, but also, people leaving Iraq to fleeing some type of persecution there. And generally speaking, most of the time that you are a country where you are more of a destination for refugees than an origin of refugees, that country is taking in refugees, is equipped to take refugees, or it is adjacent, right? So Turkey has taken in a lot of refugees from Syria because it borders Syria. There are many who cannot leave their country, even though they are refugees, and those people are internally displaced. They are leaving the area of their country where the fighting is and going to another part of their country, fleeing that, but they might not be able to cross over a border for a variety of reasons. Pull factors, it's what draws you to a specific destination. Often it is jobs, and so for example, in the United States, we have a chronic shortage of agricultural workers. A lot of our fruit and produce is still needed to be picked by hand and not by a machine. So we have a lot of people migrating to the U.S. and within the U.S. For agricultural jobs. Also other types of jobs. We tend to have problems with nursing shortages in the United States. So people traveling from other countries in order to for healthcare jobs, and again, jobs. Jobs are often a big pull for migration. Next is proximity, and so if you have to leave your country and you are pushed out of it, getting to a country that is closer to you is easier. Lots of people migrate for education. This is a billboard in Taiwan. We have lots of people who migrate to the United States to go to school here. And freedom, right? So fleeing religious or political persecution, you're going to want to go someplace where you are free to practice your religion and you are going to be free from that political persecution. And then also rejoining family, or the presence of people in your culture, right? So this is a Basque center, Basque is an area of around Spain. And so this is in Idaho, right? So there's a Basque population in Idaho. So very often you kind of get these ethnic enclaves in city, such as Chinatowns, where you are going to get people migrating in because of the presence of people of their culture. And then aesthetics as well, right? Some people are migrating to places simply because there's something else that they like about that place, or they want to live there. And again, those pull factors don't necessarily need to be something that is immediate or necessary. I recently moved. I moved closer to the beach, and that was kind of an aesthetic thing for me, right? I wanted to live closer to the beach, and I moved closer to the beach. Migration streams change constantly. If you look at this kind of historic graph from the United States, if you look at immigrants, so my mother's grandparents arrived in the U.S. right around the turn of the century, 1900 to 1910, and you can see lots and lots of immigration from Europe then. You can also see a bump in immigration from Europe after World War II. People leaving Europe to flee the violence of World War II. And then if you look at it in 2014, we have much more diverse. We have lots of people from Latin America, some people from Africa, much fewer people from Europe, people still coming from Europe, but Europe generally has a lot of good economic opportunities. Lots of people from Asia migrating. So the top countries to the USA from 1820 to 1910 were Germany, Ireland, Austria, Hungary, England, and Italy, and Russia. And then the top countries in 2015 were Mexico, China, India, Philippines, and Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. So again, that has changed. Those migration streams have changed. People still coming a lot for the same reason, right? Coming here for economic opportunities, coming here for a better life, or coming here to flee some type of persecution or violence. So some reasons for specific international migration streams. One is from less developed to more developed. Generally speaking, that is how the migration stream goes. It doesn't mean that nobody migrates from a more developed country to a less developed country, but generally speaking, you're going to have a better quality of life with concerns to things like access to education, food, housing, jobs in a more developed country. Again, that proximity, right? So people migrating to some place that is close to them. For example, Latin America to the United States, right? So people from Latin America, it's going to be pretty hard for them to migrate to Europe, as opposed to a lot of refugees from Syria are migrating into Europe because it is closer. So the Middle East and Africa to Europe versus Latin America to the US. Former colonial relationships is a very popular way that migration happens, because those countries still have a relationship with each other. So you have England colonized India. We have lots of people of Indian who either were born in India or their parents were born in India, now living in the UK. So lots of people migrating to the UK, France, and the US because of these former colonial relationships. Also, legal ease. How easy is it to migrate into a country? So once you are in the European Union, which I'll talk about in a minute, but the European Union is an economic organization of European countries, and so once you're in the EU, you can work in other places. So at the bottom here on the right, you can see in the UK a Polish food shop, and so you had lots of people from Poland migrating into the UK because there was more economic opportunity in the UK, and because they were all part of the EU, they could easily get into the UK and legally work there. Also, migrant labor programs in places like Qatar. Qatar is building stadiums for the World Cup, and they need lots of migrant labor in order to do that. Generally speaking, people in Qatar are fairly wealthy due to their money that they get from petroleum. And so lots of people migrating into Qatar for these jobs. And so when we look at migrant workers, we have national policies that encourage labor mobility. So often as a country gets more developed, and people tend to have less children, people are doing better off, so they do not want these manual labor jobs. Or we have job shortages in certain places. So we used to have the Bracero program in the US, which was created to kind of fill a gap that was left by there was no people to work on farms during World War II. So we created a farm worker guest program known as the Bracero program, which brought lots of people on these temporary work visas to the United States. The program was terribly corrupt, and I encourage you to go read about it, but generally speaking, the workers were pretty heavily mistreated. Things like the German guest worker program. So there's Angela Merkel, who is the leader of Germany. Basically, Germany, again, is an economic powerhouse of Europe. Their population is not really growing, and they need people to fill these jobs. So promoting people to come into work. This is often intended as temporary. This picture in Ireland here is of these ghost estates in Ireland. So during kind of the housing boom, lots of people were migrating from other places, especially in Eastern Europe, to Ireland and working construction jobs, building all of these houses. And when the economy took a turn, people left and went back, right? So a lot of people are migrating for work, and they left, and so there are still these kind of ghost estates, these houses that have never been filled, that were built by a lot of these workers who then left when the economy there was not doing well. And again, we have the European Union labor mobility that I talked about before, so things like people from Poland going to work in the UK. This bottom picture is Dubai from the United Arab Emirates, who has a lot of construction jobs. Again, like Qatar, Dubai's citizens are pretty wealthy and do not want construction jobs. So lots of people from South and East Asia. So this is oil-related labor because you generally have that country, the citizens of that country are really benefiting from oil wealth. And so, again, they don't want these more manual labor jobs. And this can be a human rights issue. So in Qatar and places like the UAE, there's a lot of cases of people migrating, living in very poor conditions, not being paid, and basically having their employers hold on to their passports and their visas, so they really have no choice and they have nowhere to go. When we look at international migration, we have several types, often in this order. So first is rural to rural migration. And so this is basically filling in open land, right? I'm living in a rural area. Let's say I'm a farmer. I have kids. My kids grow up. Now they want their own farm, so they're gonna migrate to another rural area where there's open land in order to fill that up. Excuse me. Then we have rural to urban migration, which is due to industrialization. So you have people migrating from rural areas to cities looking for work. We are an increasingly urbanized, the earth is becoming increasingly urbanized. So right now we have lots of rural to urban migration in places like South and East Asia and Africa. And so I also forgot to mention this picture down at the bottom for rural to rural migration, right? You have people leaving the East Coast and moving continually west throughout the decades, kind of filling in homesteading and to get, pieces of land of their own. We have intra-urban internal migration. This is suburbanization, for example, people leaving a city to go live in a suburban area, but still kind of relying on that city and being part of that metropolitan area. And then we have interurban migration, this is, for example, when you have people migrating from city to city. So as different places kind of de-industrialized, and moved over to a services sector economy. So if you want to think about places like Flint, Michigan, where there was a lot of car manufacturing, those car manufacturers left. Now people are going to leave that city, go to another city in order to find work. So there have been all types of migration streams throughout the United States. So, for example, this one is from 1995. Lots of people moving from the Northeast to the west coast of California, a smaller portion going there, a lot for jobs. We've had people migrating out of the South to the West for economic opportunity, people migrating from the West to the South for cheaper housing, cheaper cost of living. So again, lots of migration streams within the United States. Excuse me. And then we have some patterns in other countries as well. Places that are in different stages of development, different economic and geographic realities. So there's some interesting interregional net migration within Brazil. The government there built kind of cities in the middle of nowhere for people to fill in, including Brasilia, which is a very interesting and an oddly planned city. But lots of people kind of leaving other areas. And then we have places like in Russia, where generally speaking, the majority of the population is in the West. And then as kind of the Soviet Union collapsed and those economic opportunities left, people migrated towards the East. And then as those economic opportunities improved, they're migrating back to the West. Rural to urban migration, again, is kind of the largest migratory trend right now. Over 20 million people a year globally migrate from rural to urban areas. China has becoming increasingly urbanized over the past few decades. This is happening more in developed countries. Generally speaking, they are less urban to begin with. So the United States and Europe are already pretty heavily urbanized. So places like Angola, China, South Korea, right? Angola is economically behind China. They have a higher rate of urbanization compared to China, which again is crossed over the 50% threshold, compared to South Korea, which is already pretty darn urban, so not a lot of opportunity for migration there. When we look at the change from 1950 to 2010, right, we had a lot of Latin America going from 40 to 80% urban, Asia from 15 to 45% urban, this is Asia as a whole, and Sub-Saharan Africa from 10 to 40% urban. And this trend is continuing. At the bottom here, there are homeless migrants in Cape Town, South Africa, that are sleeping in a park. South Africa had a lot of economic opportunities, so you have people migrating to cities like Cape Town and Johannesburg, especially from surrounding countries or even from within rural South Africa, right? They are coming there, and sometimes they do not have a place once they get there. So they can have significant social, economic, and stresses on a city, including things like shanty towns, which are these slums or informal settlements that are usually on the outskirts of these cities. So people will show up for jobs and there's no housing for them, and they will create housing. Very often these people are still working, but there's just not the housing or infrastructure. So, but also not enough jobs for all rural to urban migrants. There's not enough money for infrastructure, and so we have this ad hoc construction in less desirable areas. There are some obstacles to migration. The first and probably most obvious is being cost and distance. My PowerPoint glitched there for a second. Also legal barriers, so things like quota laws that only allow a certain number of people to migrate from certain countries, prohibitions to migration or immigration, and then financial and professional restrictions. There's also cultural barriers. If you don't speak the language of the country you're migrating to, that can be more difficult, as well as just general acceptance once you get there. So this is a scene from several years ago where we have protesters blocking buses of immigrants in San Diego. And then physical barriers, right? We have a border fence partially on the U.S.-Mexican border. We also have natural features like rivers that prevent people from migrating across the border. And then we have unauthorized migration, often referred to as illegal immigration. So this happens in a few ways. One, people come here legally or to other countries, not just to the United States, and they overstay their visas. So they get a visa to come here for a certain amount of time, and then they do not leave and they overstay their visa. They also go around barriers. For example, the push right now by some to build a wall across the entire border between the U.S. and Mexico is to prevent people from going around those barriers. People are generally hard to track once they get into a country. So we have 11.7 people in the United States who are living here without documentation. 52% of those are from Mexico, and most others are from other Latin American countries. It's important to know that this peaked in 2007. So while most people kind of think that we are on the influx of people migrating illegally into the United States, this is actually not true. In that 10, 11-year period since there, it's been on the trajectory to actually decrease. And so when we look at our estimated unauthorized immigrant population, right, our total, again, a large portion of that is from Mexico, which is for economic opportunities. Again, I said earlier that we had, for an example, a shortage of farm workers. And so people coming to the U.S. For that. It's been a slight decline since, but the number has been about stable. So some immigration concerns in the U.S., and again, this has been in the news a lot lately, and you're going to have to write about it for one of your exercises. Are we building a wall, or are we not building a wall? The wall between Mexico and the United States exists in some places. It does not exist in others. Some places it's chain link fence. Some places it's natural barriers. We added a lot of barriers after 9/11. Quite a few, and generally speaking, we don't have them in places where it is more difficult to cross due to physical features or other types of obstacles. People are concerned about the labor market. This is from South Park, right? Generally concerned that people are coming here and they are taking jobs away from American citizens. That historically has not shown to be true, because generally speaking, people are taking jobs that American citizens do not want. I talked before about people migrating into the UAE and Qatar, taking jobs, not taking jobs, but going there for jobs that the average citizen did not want. The average U.S. citizen does not want to work at these farm labor jobs, or to work in things like in kitchens or the food service industry. These jobs are not kind of a zero sum. So it's not like if those people were not here, there would be an increase for jobs for Americans. And it's important to note that more people moved from the U.S. to Mexico in 2015 than vice versa, right? An improving economy in Mexico makes people move in the other direction. Then questions around people who are here, should they be deported or granted amnesty? Things like DACA, which DACA is for, or was, it has ended, and it's in kind of a bit of a legal battle right now. But basically, people who were brought to the United States as children, who are living in the United States, right, were brought here, as children. They didn't really have a choice, and have been living here, going to school here, do not have a criminal record, generally pursuing education. These people under DACA were allowed to kind of come out of the shadows and register with the government. It's deferred action for childhood arrivals. So the idea is we are basically going to allow you to not be constantly worried about deportation. You are not going to be targeted for deportation, but you are going to, what's going to prevent that is by you registering with the government, which the current administration ended DACA, and again, it's been a legal battle. And then those people are called the Dreamers, and there's been a variety of legislation proposed, including a variety of DREAM Acts, giving people possibly some pathway to amnesty or deportation. A path to citizenship for some people, right? So if you have been in the United States since you were 3 years old and now you're 25 and you are a contributing member of society and getting your education and have no criminal history, a lot of people think that you should get some type of path to citizenship because you've been here for 20 some odd years. Also concerns to taxation and benefits. So people are very concerned about whether or not people who are here without documentation are paying taxes. They are paying taxes. They're paying taxes in a variety of ways. But a lot of people think that they do not pay any taxes. But every time somebody purchases something, they're paying taxes. And then whether or not they're kind of reaping the benefits of being a citizen without actually being a citizen. And then concerns around drugs. There's we have a large demand for illegal substances in the United States, and a lot of those come from Latin America, transporting disease, and then also terrorism, which is often the kind of big one that is used, right? We need to protect our borders to protect against terrorism. Most people support some type of legal immigration. There are some people who say that we should close our borders completely and not allow any immigration, but most people support some type of legal immigration. For example, this is a tweet. I'm sick of these illegals. I have no problem with people wanting to come over here right now, but illegals get out of here, and I support President Trump all the way. A lot of people will point to their grandparents, such as my grandparents, arriving here through a legal fashion. But it was also very easy for Europeans, and historically has been easy for Europeans, to immigrate to the United States. There's been a lot less obstacles to that happening. And at that time, we were allowing kind of a huge influx of people to immigrate into the United States. There are also immigration concerns in Europe. There's been recent massive influx of people, partially because of the refugee crisis. And then once you get into Europe, because of the European Union, it is easy to move within Europe. But this kind of open border policy is now in doubt because a lot of countries are kind of taking the brunt of refugees, and they don't want that. And a lot of kind of nationalist movements, people worried about immigrants kind of changing the core culture of these countries. So unauthorized migration is generally more dangerous for those who are migrating. And there is a lot of open hostility towards non-Europeans. There is a less of a history in Europe of immigration and diversity. So unlike the United States, who's kind of, one of our kind of core things is that we are a country of immigrants, which is true and not true. But there's less of that in Europe. There's also some countries in Europe that have really high unemployment rates, Spain and Greece, that are worried about taking in migrants. A lot of these migrants and refugees are really trying to get to places like Germany, where there are economic opportunities for them. And then also concerns about recent terrorism in Europe, that basically a lot of people who are migrating from the Middle East, especially Syria, are going to harm European citizens in some ways. And then lots of nationalist movements. There's one at the top from France. Recently, England left the European Union, or is in the process of leaving it now. But we need to preserve our culture, and we are kind of under threat from these migrants who are coming in. So this is an example in Switzerland from 2009. Minarets, which are on mosques. There was a proposed minaret ban, so basically not allowing any more minarets to be built because they were worried about changing the culture. And you could see here on this poster, right, that the person looks very kind of dark and sinister, kind of this evil Muslim that's coming in and trying to kind of take over that culture. In reality, Muslims are a very small percentage of people living in Europe, and even if they took in all of the refugees from Syria, it really would not have a very large difference on the makeup as a whole. So Islamophobia is pretty common in Europe, not just this minaret ban, but different places banning the hijab. In France, they tried to banish the burkini, which is basically a more conservative swimsuit. And so you wind up with less acceptance and then more alienation of those people who are already there. Most recent Islamic terrorists in Europe were European born. And a lot of people argue that it's this Islamophobia that leads to these people becoming radicalized in the first place. And then we have the migrant refugee crisis. In 2015, over 1 million migrants crossed the Mediterranean to Europe. Almost 3,800 of them died. It's a very difficult journey. In 2016 and 2017, there were fewer migrants, but more deaths. 1 in 100 people does not make that journey. Basically these people are fleeing violence and persecution, especially from Syria. They are flooding into neighboring countries, into refugee camps, where the conditions are often horrific. And so they are making the very sad choice to get on these boats because they are basically fleeing a horrific situation, and it is worth to them to risk their lives to try to get to Europe in order to escape that. And so that is our lecture for Chapter 3. You're now going to move on to 2 exercises and then move on to Chapter 4, which is all about folk and pop culture, excuse me.